The air in the small sunlit room of the retirement home was thick with the scent of antiseptic and old roses. It was a smell I'd come to associate with my grandmother, Evelyn, a woman whose world had shrunk to the size of these four beige walls, but whose spirit still felt as vast as the sky. It was her 85th birthday, and the tiny cake with its single sputtering candle sat on her bedside table, a cheerful but lonely beacon. My sister Vanessa was late, as usual. She breezed in 20 minutes after me, all apologies and Chanel No. 5, kissing the air near Evelyn's cheek. I sat on a stiff visitor's chair, my hands clasped around a simple bouquet of daisies I'd bought from a street vendor. They felt earnest and a little pathetic next to the opulent gift bag Vanessa now placed on our grandmother's lap. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Vanessa said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "I got you something you're going to absolutely love." Evelyn, her hands gnarled with age but her eyes still sharp, fumbled with the glossy paper. Inside was a large silver-plated photo frame. It was ornate, with intricate carvings of vines and leaves, clearly expensive. But as Evelyn lifted it from the tissue paper, a collective, silent gasp filled the room. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from the top left corner of the glass, a glaring imperfection in the otherwise flawless facade. One of the silver vines was bent, its delicate leaf snapped clean off. It was broken. A heavy silence descended. I stared at Vanessa, my throat tightening. How could she? How could she be so careless, so thoughtless? This wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of everything Vanessa was. All surface, no substance. "Oh," Evelyn said softly, her fingers tracing the fracture in the glass. Her voice was frail, a wisp of its former strength. "It's lovely, dear." "It must have happened in the car," Vanessa said with a dismissive wave of her hand. She didn't sound sorry. She sounded annoyed, as if the frame had personally inconvenienced her. "Honestly, the traffic was a nightmare. I'll get it exchanged, of course. Just put a picture of us in it for now. It'll cover the crack." She didn't get it. She never did. For Grandma Evelyn, memories were everything. A photograph wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a captured moment, a fragment of a life lived. To place it in a broken frame felt like an insult, a suggestion that the memory itself was damaged, tainted. I watched as my grandmother placed the frame carefully on her nightstand, turning it just so, as if trying to hide the flaw. She looked smaller in that moment, her shoulders slumped. The light in her eyes, which had flickered so brightly just moments before, seemed to dim. She was trying to be gracious, to smooth over the jagged edges of Vanessa's carelessness, just as she had done for our family her entire life. "It's all right, dear," she murmured, patting Vanessa's hand. "Don't you worry about it." But I worried. I worried a lot. I saw the hurt she was trying to hide, and a familiar, bitter anger rose in me. An anger at Vanessa for her casual cruelty, but also a deeper, older anger at the injustice of it all. Evelyn had sacrificed so much for our family. When our parents passed away in a car crash, she was the one who raised us. She sold her beautiful, rambling house, the house where she'd raised her own children, the house filled with a lifetime of memories, to give us a better future. She poured everything she had into making sure Vanessa and I could go to college, have careers, build lives she could be proud of. And this was her reward? A tiny, sterile room in a place that smelled of decay, and a broken gift from a granddaughter who couldn't even be bothered to check if it was intact. Vanessa had a high-paying job, a fancy apartment, a life of luxury that was built in part on the foundation of Evelyn's sacrifice. I was a teacher, my life quieter, more modest. I couldn't buy her expensive things, but I gave her my time. I visited every week, bringing her books and flowers and stories from my classroom. I sat with her, held her hand, and listened. I tried to fill her small room with a sense of the world she'd lost. Later, after Vanessa had swept out with another airy promise to sort everything out, I stayed behind. The broken frame sat on the nightstand like a silent accusation. "She meant well, Sophie," Evelyn said, though her gaze was fixed on the crack in the glass. "No, she didn't," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "She didn't think at all. That's the problem." Evelyn sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 85 years. "Your sister. She sees the world differently, that's all. She sees the big picture, the money, the success. She thinks that's what matters." "And what do you think matters, Grandma?" I asked, my voice softening. She turned her gaze to me, and her eyes were clear and full of a love that felt like the only truly unbroken thing in the world. "You," she said simply, "and the memories we make. That's all we have in the end, isn't it? A collection of moments." She reached for the frame again, her touch surprisingly gentle on the damaged silver. "Even a broken frame can hold a beautiful memory," she whispered. "Sometimes, the most precious things are the ones that have been through a little trouble." I didn't understand the depth of her words then. I just saw the sadness in her smile and felt the burn of injustice in my heart. I didn't know that this broken frame was the beginning of a revelation, one that would shatter my perception of my family, my sister, and the true meaning of my grandmother's legacy. The days that followed my grandmother's birthday were heavy with a quiet sort of grief. The image of the cracked frame and the look on Evelyn's face as she held it was burned into my mind. It became a symbol of all the cracks in our family, the fractures we never acknowledged, but that ran deep beneath the surface. Vanessa, true to form, didn't mention it again. A week passed, then two. The frame, I was sure, remained on Evelyn's nightstand, a monument to a broken promise. I couldn't stand it. If Vanessa wouldn't fix her mistake, I would. On my next visit, I found Evelyn dozing, her breathing soft and shallow. The frame was where I'd last seen it. Up close, the damage was worse than I remembered. The silver was bent back at an unnatural angle, and the tiny snapped leaf was missing entirely. I wrapped it carefully in a soft cloth and tucked it into my bag, leaving a note on her pillow. "Taking this to get fixed. I love you. Sophie." I found a small, dusty repair shop downtown, run by an old man with glasses perched on the end of his nose and fingers stained with a lifetime of polish and chemicals. He took the frame from me, his touch surprisingly reverent. "Ah, a beautiful piece," he murmured, turning it over in his hands. "They don't make them with this kind of detail anymore. A shame about the damage." "Can it be fixed?" I asked, a hopeful tremor in my voice. "Oh yes," he said, his eyes twinkling. "The silver can be mended. The glass can be replaced. But this is interesting." He pointed to the back of the frame, to a small, almost invisible seam in the velvet backing. "This isn't just a frame, it's a locket." My brow furrowed. "A locket? For a photo frame?" "Of a sort," the old man explained. He picked up a delicate tool from his workbench and gently worked it into the seam. There was a soft click, and a section of the velvet backing swung open on a tiny hidden hinge, revealing a shallow, hollow compartment. My heart seemed to stop. The compartment wasn't empty. Nestled inside was a small tarnished brass key and a piece of paper, folded into a tiny, tight square and yellowed with age. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Looks like a secret," the jeweler said with a small smile. "I'll get to work on the frame. You see to that." My hands trembled as I took the small key and the folded paper. I walked out of the shop in a daze and sat on a park bench, the city's noise fading into a distant hum. The key was ornate, old-fashioned. The paper felt brittle, fragile, as if it might turn to dust in my fingers. I carefully unfolded it. It was a letter, written in my grandmother's familiar, elegant cursive, though the handwriting was stronger, more fluid than the shaky script I knew today. "My dearest girls," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have found my secret. It means that the frame I entrusted to you has broken. I pray the break was not a result of anger or carelessness, but a simple accident. For this frame, like our family, is more precious and more complicated than it appears. And sometimes it takes a fracture to let the light in. You believe I sold our home, the house on Willow Creek Lane, to give you a future. That is the story I allowed you to believe. It was simpler that way, but it is not the truth. The truth is, I could never bring myself to sell it. It held too much of your grandfather, too much of your parents, too much of you. Selling it would have felt like selling my own heart. The money I gave you for your education, for your lives, was from a different source, a small inheritance your grandfather left for a rainy day. I suppose the loss of your parents was the storm he never could have predicted. But the house is still ours. I could not keep up with the taxes, so I made an arrangement. I sold it to a trusted friend under the condition that I could buy it back, at the original price, at any time. A legal contract is hidden away. Safe. The house has been sitting empty all these years, a sleeping memory waiting to be woken. The key inside this frame is the key to the front door. I read the letter again, and then a third time, the words blurring through a sudden rush of tears. My entire understanding of the past 15 years, of my grandmother's grand sacrifice, crumbled. It wasn't a sacrifice of her home. It was a sacrifice of the truth. She had let us believe she was destitute, living in a sterile room by necessity, all while the home we grew up in, the heart of our family, sat waiting. Why? Why would she construct such an elaborate deception? And then, I read the final lines of the letter. Go to the house. I cannot tell you what you will find there, only that it is the most important part of our story. Go together. And Sophie, please, try to understand your sister. Vanessa has always carried a heavier burden than you know. The letter ended there. No explanation. No further details. Just a key, a cryptic message, and a plea for understanding that I couldn't possibly grant. A heavier burden? Vanessa, with her perfect life and casual cruelty? The idea was absurd. I sat on that bench for what felt like an eternity, the brass key cold in my palm, the letter a fragile testament to a past I never knew. The broken frame had opened a door, not just in its velvet backing, but in the very foundation of my family's history. And my grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Go to the house. Anger is a straightforward emotion. It's clean, it's sharp, and it has a clear target. But as I sat on that park bench, the anger I held for Vanessa began to curdle into something far more confusing. Betrayal. Not just by my sister, but by my grandmother. The narrative of my life, the one in which I was the dutiful granddaughter honoring the matriarch who had sacrificed everything, was a lie. A well-intentioned lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. And what was this nonsense about Vanessa's heavier burden? I tried to imagine it. Was her high-pressure job stressful? Was it exhausting maintaining a perfect facade? It felt like a flimsy excuse for her years of self-absorption. My burden was real. I was the one who sat through the long silences in that sterile room, the one who saw the flicker of loneliness in our grandmother's eyes. I was the one who cared. For a brief, selfish moment, I considered not telling her. I could go to the house myself, unlock its secrets, and claim the moral high ground. It would be so easy. It was my discovery, after all. I was the one who'd bothered to get the frame fixed. But my grandmother's words, scrawled on that fragile paper, held me back. Go together. And then, the more challenging plea. Try to understand your sister. It felt like a final wish, a dying instruction. To ignore it would be a betrayal of a different kind, a betrayal of Evelyn's memory. My anger at Vanessa was a hot, burning thing, but my love for my grandmother was a deeper, more enduring fire. I folded the letter, tucked it safely into my purse with the key, and drove to Vanessa's apartment. Her building was a sleek tower of glass and steel that scraped the sky, a place that always made me feel small and out of place. She answered the door in silk pajamas, a glass of wine in her hand, looking effortlessly glamorous even at the end of the day. Sophie? What is it? Is it Grandma? Is she okay? A flicker of genuine concern crossed her face, and for a second, I felt a pang of guilt for the anger I was harboring. She's fine, I said, my voice flat. We need to talk. I followed her into the immaculate living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a glittering panorama of the city, a view that probably cost more than my annual salary. Everything was white and chrome and minimalist. It was a magazine cover, not a home. There wasn't a single photograph of our family in sight. All right, she said, sinking into a white leather sofa. You look like you're about to deliver a verdict. What's going on? I didn't waste time. I placed the old brass key on her glass coffee table. It looked alien in the sterile environment. Then I handed her the letter. I watched her face as she read. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in a confused frown. Her wine glass sat untouched. She read it once, her lips moving silently, and then she read it again, her breath catching in a soft, choked sound. When she finally looked up at me, the mask of cool composure was gone. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. The bravado, the arrogance, the casual dismissiveness, it all vanished, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability I had never seen in her before. She kept the house? Vanessa whispered. The question was so quiet, so full of a pain I didn't understand, that it threw me completely off balance. I had expected defensiveness, maybe even an accusation. I had not expected this shattered fragility. She lied to us, I said, my voice still holding an edge of accusation. For 15 years. She let us believe she was living in that awful place because she had no choice. No, Vanessa said, shaking her head, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. No, you don't understand. She wasn't lying to us. She was lying to you. For me. I stared at her, utterly bewildered. What are you talking about? Vanessa stood up and walked to the window, her back to me as she looked out at the city lights. That rainy day inheritance from Grandpa? It wasn't small, Sophie. It was substantial. More than enough for our education, with plenty left over. She turned back to face me, her expression one of deep, abiding shame. When I was in my final year of university, I made a mistake. A big one. I got involved with a bad business idea. Some people I shouldn't have trusted. I was young and stupid, and I thought I knew everything. I lost it all, Sophie. Every last cent of the remaining inheritance. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. I was too ashamed to tell you, she continued, her voice cracking. And I couldn't bear to tell Grandma, to tell her I had squandered the future she and Grandpa had saved for us. So I made a deal with her. I begged her not to sell the house. I promised her I would earn every penny back, that I would make sure she was taken care of, that I would build a life that would make her proud. The story about selling the house. We created it together. It was my way of hiding the truth of my failure from you. Grandma agreed because she loved me. She was protecting me. Suddenly, her entire life made sense. The relentless drive for success, the high-paying job, the expensive apartment, the constant need to project an image of flawless achievement. It wasn't about greed or status. It was penance. It was a desperate 15-year-long attempt to atone for a single catastrophic mistake. The heavier burden wasn't a metaphor. It was a debt. The broken frame, I said, the words catching in my throat. I was so angry at myself, she said, a fresh wave of tears falling. I wanted to give her something perfect, something to show her that I was finally making good on my promise. And when I saw it was broken, it just felt like another failure, a sign that I can never fix what I broke. The anger in my heart dissolved, washed away by a tidal wave of empathy. All these years, I had seen her as the villain of our story. But I was the one who hadn't seen the truth. I saw carelessness where there was shame. I saw arrogance where there was regret. While I had been tending to my grandmother's loneliness, Vanessa had been trying to rebuild a fortune she had lost. A fortune I never even knew existed. We had been trying to care for Evelyn in the only ways we knew how, blind to the sacrifices the other was making. I crossed the room and stood in front of her. For the first time since we were children, I felt like I was truly seeing my sister. We have to go, I said softly. We have to go to the house. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Yes, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. We do. She looked at the key on the table, then back at me. Together. The drive to Willow Creek Lane was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. A stark contrast to the years of tense, brittle quiet that had defined our relationship. We sat side by side, two women who had spent a lifetime looking at each other, but never truly seeing. The city's sleek, modern towers gave way to sprawling suburbs, and then to the familiar, winding country roads of our childhood. Each turn, each ancient oak tree, was a step further back in time. The house was just as I remembered it, and yet utterly changed. A grand old Victorian lady, fallen on hard times. The paint was peeling, the once vibrant garden was choked with weeds, and a shutter hung crookedly from a second-story window like a broken eyelid. It looked forgotten. It looked like we felt. Vanessa parked the car, and for a long moment, we just sat and stared. I can't believe it's still here, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I used to dream about this place, about the smell of Grandma's baking, about the way the sun hit the landing in the afternoon. I did too, I admitted. My hand was shaking as I pulled the old brass key from my pocket. It felt ancient, sacred. Together we walked up the stone path, our footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The key slid into the lock with a rusty scrape. I took a deep breath, turned it, and the lock clicked open with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. We pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The air was still and cool, carrying the scent of dust, decaying paper, and the faint, ghostly perfume of my grandmother's potpourri. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced through the grimy windows. The furniture, our entire childhood, was draped in white sheets, silent, sleeping forms that held the shape of our past. It was a mausoleum of memories. We moved through the downstairs rooms in a shared trance, our fingers tracing lines in the dust on the covered piano, our eyes lingering on the spot where the Christmas tree always stood. Without a word, we both began to climb the creaking staircase, drawn upward by an invisible thread. We walked down the hallway to our grandmother's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was just as she had left it 15 years ago, only shrouded in dust and time. The big four-poster bed, the vanity with its three-paneled mirror, the cozy armchair by the window where she used to read to us. And on the small writing desk by that window, a stack of leather-bound journals sat in a neat pile. On top of them was a single thick envelope with my dearest girls, written in Evelyn's frail, later-in-life handwriting. Vanessa and I looked at each other, and then together, we sat on the edge of the dusty bed. With trembling fingers, I opened the letter. Vanessa leaned in, and we read it together. My dearest girls, if you are reading this, then all my secrets are out, and you have found your way home. I hope you found it together. This house, you see, was never a secret to be kept, but a gift to be found. I couldn't bear to sell it, not when it was the last piece of the family we had. But more than that, I knew that one day, you would need it. Not for its monetary value, but for what it is. A foundation. A place to come back to, a place to heal. Vanessa, my brave, brave girl. I know you have carried the weight of your mistake for so long, but please know, I never saw it as a failure. I saw it as a detour on the path to the incredible woman you would become. Your drive, your ambition. I know it was born from a place of shame, but I was always so proud of the strength it gave you. You rebuilt what was lost and more. You have atoned 1,000 times over. It is time to forgive yourself. Sophie, my gentle soul. You gave me the greatest gift of all, your time. In the quiet loneliness of my last years, your visits were the sunshine that broke through the clouds. You sat with me. You listened. You remembered. You kept my world from shrinking to nothing. Never for a moment think your gift was smaller than your sister's. You both cared for me perfectly, in the ways you knew how. You were the two halves of my heart. The journals hold my story, our story. But the future is yours to write. This house is yours. Let it be a new beginning. Fill its quiet rooms with laughter again. Heal the cracks, not just in the walls of this old house, but in your own family. The most precious things are the ones that have been through a little trouble. Tears were streaming down both our faces, falling onto the fragile paper. The last line was the same thing she had said to me in the retirement home about the broken frame. Only now, I understood. We spent the rest of the afternoon in that dusty, sunlit room opening the journals. We saw our lives through our grandmother's eyes. Vanessa read passages about how Evelyn cherished my quiet strength. I read passages where Evelyn worried about the silent burden Vanessa carried, long before I knew what it was. She saw us both, fully and completely. She understood us more than we understood ourselves. We found her will, tucked into the final journal. The house, the small amount of money she had left in her bank account, everything was to be split perfectly, equally, between us. As evening approached, we stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the overgrown garden. The anger and resentment I had carried for so long had been replaced by a profound, aching love. I looked at my sister, at the lines of exhaustion and years of stress on her face, and saw not a rival, but a partner. She gave us a road map, Vanessa said quietly, her voice full of wonder. A way back to each other. She gave us a home, I replied. I thought of the broken frame, the catalyst for it all. I had brought it with me, still wrapped in its cloth. I had called the old man and told him I'd be back. We would put a new photo in it. A new photo of the two of us, standing on the porch of the house on Willow Creek Lane. The frame wasn't a symbol of failure anymore. It was a symbol of our story. A story of a family that had been fractured but never truly broken. A family that had finally, after all these years, found its way home.